Thanks for tuning in to the Crescent Method. This is Scott. I was putting together some examples for our upcoming soil balancing class, which starts next Thursday, June 2nd, and will be going at 6 p.m. Mountain Time. And I wanted to put together some examples for that class, and there was one that I came across that I wanted to share for tonight's show. I had a prior engagement, so this isn't a live show. And if you are tuning in live, leave your comments and I'll circle back around and get to those questions in the next couple days. The example that I wanted to go over is a project that Sarah's been working on that's a market garden that had some native soil that was an abandoned field that had been abandoned for quite some time, and they're now turning it into a market garden. And so just like pretty much every gardener on the planet, I think, would do, they put a layer of compost about 3 to 5 inches thick on top of that native soil, and then put some wood chip mulch and planted their plants. And those plants, plain and simply, didn't do very well. And so when Sarah was brought on to work on this project, the first thing that we do is always take a soil chemistry test and do a biological analysis to try and see what's going on in that system with those plants. So in this case, we're going to cover the soil chemistry of that project. So here's a Logan report for the municipal compost that is on top of the native soil. Typically, I first look at this exchange capacity, which is a 37.4. That explains the totality of nutrients in this soil, kind of like the size of your gas tank. Typically, for most of our listeners who are growing cannabis, I try to keep this number somewhere between 18 and 25. If it's a native soil, maybe a little bit less, but nonetheless, plenty of nutrient. So that's somewhat attractive at the beginning. pH is a little bit high at 7.6, which I tend to look at pH as an indication of how balanced that soil is. We never take a forceful up or down strategy to try and move pH, but rather we take a strategy to adjust the minerals in that soil to reflect a more attractive pH. Moving down, we've got a 34.1 organic matter, so pretty high organic matter percentage, which is what we're after with that top dressing of compost. The sulfur is at 167 parts per million, which is pretty good, especially for vegetables. But as we start to come down, you start to really see some of the problems. So we're seeing 1,400, almost 1,500 parts per million of phosphorus, which in the case of this municipal compost is likely coming from the inheritance of over-fertilized lawns, trees and shrubs, and in a lot of cases, agricultural crops. So we're inheriting a lot of the habits of our neighbors in this municipal compost. We're also likely inheriting pesticides, chemicals, and a bunch of other stuff that we don't want. But nonetheless, moving down, we've got over 3,000 parts per million of calcium, which is a good place to be. We need to be at least 2,000 parts per million there in order to have a good yield and outcome. You can see that the magnesium is a little bit high, and as we get to potassium, you see the actual problems here. Very common for fast, high production compost facilities that rush their process to have extremely high values for potassium. And 4,000 parts per million of potassium is just pretty redonkulous, to be clear. Sodium's at 240 parts per million. That's another very unattractive number. I tend to look at this gray stripe on the Logan test, which is the base saturation, which indicates how much of the soil particle is occupied by a given cation, which would be calcium, magnesium, potassium, or sodium. Dr. Albrecht, who came up with this method, believed that calcium should be somewhere around 68%, magnesium should be somewhere around 12%, and potassium somewhere around 4%. In the case of cannabis and in the case of potting soils, we tend to run that higher. Some people go as high as 80% for calcium. I tend to keep it somewhere between 68 and 74 for potting soils or compost, and that tends to work pretty well. So you can see at 45%, we are extremely low, and this isn't a linear number. We don't just need to increase by 23%. We probably need to triple or quadruple that calcium value in order to affect this in such a way that it would then occupy 68% of that soil particle. So At well below 60%, you're even going to have a hard time building up calcium in that soil. If you use gypsum, which is calcium sulfate, the sulfur is likely to dislodge the calcium and you're not going to see a building up of calcium. So if you try to solve this problem entirely with gypsum, it's likely that you'll not really increase the calcium value on the Malic 3 test, and you're going to see the sulfur come up to a point to where you can no longer use gypsum as a tool, which is something we see a lot with people that are trying to affect everything with gypsum. When potassium's up as high as 30%, even if you're using this for a soil where you would be cutting this into the overall mix at a third, you're still going to be at 10% or higher in your potassium, which is higher than we really like to see. So even if this compost was mixed into a soil at a third, we're likely to be in a pretty bad shape. At least the boron, you got plenty of boron, 3 parts per million, boatload of iron, not near enough manganese. Iron and manganese work together, and when iron is much higher than manganese, it actually antagonizes manganese. So manganese is also going to be what the plant uses to throttle the uptake of that excessive potassium. And when iron is this much higher, it's likely to antagonize that. So the plant doesn't have the ability to stop the luxury consumption of that potassium, we'll say. And then copper and zinc work together as well. So we've got well more than twice the copper and zinc. So typically that's an indication of construction waste, all the nails and metal and whatever else they throw in there, I guess. Cobalt, molybdenum could use a bump, but that's not really the primary focus for this particular context. I think some of the biggest issues are right here with the nitrogen. I'm pretty sure this is the highest ammonium value I've seen on any Logan test at almost 96 parts per million. Typically, this is less than 8 part per million. In this case, the compost does smell like ammonia, and the plants are acting like their feet are very hot, we'll say. Nitrate is over 100, so combined we've got 220 parts per million of nitrogen, which in cannabis that would absolutely be a bug problem. I try to keep this well below 200 parts per million. If this was cannabis, this is 21 parts per million of silicon, so it would be terpy. So that's one interesting thing about it, but definitely not going to be in good shape for vegetables. And when Sarah got brought onto this project, this was already in place, and the plants were just literally not growing. The plants some of them had emerged from their seed out of the ground and just kind of stayed there. So some radishes that were like 30, 40-day plants were not really maturing. A lot of the bell peppers just looked torched and just kind of stayed about that low. When we get down to the saturated paste test, so this is now what's water soluble in this material, you start to see where a lot of the problems are. Again, high pH. Again, that's not my first concern, but we definitely need to look at it. Chloride is at 500. That's enough to clean a swimming pool. And the bicarbonate is at 781 parts per million. Chloride is an accumulator and displaces other elements, so you're going to have a really hard time getting nutrients into this plant, most specifically calcium. So this is just going to be kind of a hot mess all the way around. Sulfur is quite high. Phosphorus, again, very high, likely inheriting some NPK, heavily fertilized crops into this municipal compost, a lot of lawn clippings maybe. You can see that potassium is damn near 10 times calcium. That's not going to be good for business at all. Coming down to this section, this is how we determine the percentage saturation on this saturated paste test. So I like to look at these for both tests. And this one's just upside down. You should see about 60% for the calcium. We're at 13. You should see about 13 for the potassium, and we're at 60. Magnesium's at least where it should be, but in this situation, you have potassium, 4.5, 5 times higher than calcium, and you have sodium almost higher than calcium. In this situation, good luck getting calcium into this plant. We've got a lot of boron, a lot of iron, and at least there's some trace mineral present, so that's, somewhat positive. But all in all, this is, shaping up to be kind of a hot mess. Interestingly enough, when you scroll down to the native soil that was below the compost, that I think almost 0 out of 10 gardeners would look at this soil and say, yes, I can put my plants directly in it without any correction, but numerically it's damn near perfect. Just looks like a abandoned field though, so it doesn't look like it's really prime for crops. But this is why we always do the test, because the numbers will tell you exactly how attractive or unattractive that soil is. So we've got 21.3, so that's enough nutrient to get a commercial yield in cannabis. It's definitely enough to get some vegetables out of the ground. pH is a little high. Again, it's because our elements are out of balance. For native soil, 4.3% organic matter almost is a lot. So this is, looking very good for a native soil. Sulfur, we're going to need to get to at least 100, and phosphorus, probably want to increase that as well. Calcium's over 3,000 parts per million. So far we're damn near above all the minimums. Magnesium is fairly attractive. Potassium's a little bit high, but not problematic. And so from a base saturation standpoint, we're at 73, 13, and 9. This would be acceptable for a lot of situations just in its current form. I might fine tune this just a little bit, but you could pretty much add a little bit of sulfur and a little bit of phosphorus and just farm in this. We've got some boron. I think this is one of the few times where manganese is fairly close to iron. So this is one of the few times we'd add iron, but probably not manganese. And again, we've got lots of zinc. We need to increase the copper. Cobalt, molybdenum could use a boost, but again, we have other primary focuses first. That'd probably be a secondary consideration. Ammonia is more normal here at 4, and nitrates, at 36. So, add 30, 40, 50 parts per million of nitrogen to this, a little bit of sulfur, and you could have a fantastic yield. Again, almost 31 parts per million of silica. When we work with the guys that are doing fancy cannabis extracts, they're normally trying to get this up to 10 or 15 or more. Most gardens are in the 4 to 6 range. So, at almost 31 parts per million of silica, they'd probably be quite terpy. When we move on down to the saturated paste test, now there's no biology in here. It's fairly compacted. It's been weathered, not farmed. So our total nutrient pool on this one's a little bit low, but that's nothing a little biologically complete compost couldn't fix. Very low in the chloride, very low in the bicarbonate. And if we scroll down to our percent saturation, we're damn near perfect on this old abandoned field. So, again, we need to increase soluble calcium by about 10%, which would drop this and this slightly, and you'd be looking pretty good. Throw a little trace mineral on this, and this would be a very attractive soil. And so the situation that we have is very common that a lot of farmers do, and the farmers know that they need to maintain organic matter, and they always want to top dress compost. In the context of commercial cannabis, which is where I spend most of my time, there is a need to increase organic matter, and there is a need to increase that soil volume. The plants do eat the soil very literally, and it goes down over time. And so there's a need to physically build up that permanent soil. There's a need to increase and maintain that organic matter. But I always put the priority of soil chemistry first. And so my personal preference, because I've seen so many situations in cannabis where people top dress compost that might have come from one of those attractive labels you've been told to believe in, and it has, frankly, pretty crappy numbers like this, and then you spend a couple harvests trying to get rid of that chloride, a lot of times getting rid of the sodium from the cow manure or whatever it was used, getting rid of the exchangeable hydrogen from the dead fish parts. And so I think it complicates the soil chemistry and long-term management of that soil far greater than most people really understand. And so as somebody who performs these calculations, this one's quite a predicament, because we have damn near perfect soil, and then we have, a certain amount of compost on top of that that has just completely different skiwampus chemistry. And so how do you manage that? Do you average them? Do you try to balance them independently? Well, you certainly can't shove minerals underneath the compost layer. So, that's not going to work. So if we come back to our soil test, and we overlay the calculator here. Oops, got the wrong number in there. So got this filled in with our soil test. So we've got 33.99 for our calcium, 840 for our magnesium, and 42.87 for our potassium. The calculator for base saturation also needs sodium, other bases, and exchangeable hydrogen. And this up here is your exchange capacity. And then down here is the base saturation, just to see how any adjustments you do will affect it. So one of the strategies that I like to take is, if we're going to top dress with compost, I prefer to balance the chemistry in that compost best I can before I put it onto the soil. And so in order to do that, you would need to, in a very calculated fashion, add those amendments to a known soil volume, which we go a lot deeper into in the soil balancing class. But for now, just numerically kind of wrap your head around this, right? So we're trying to get this number all the way to at least 60, ideally 68, 72% maybe. We're trying to have magnesium somewhere around 20 and potassium, ideally less than 10%. So you could do this a lot of ways. One way is to just start putting numbers into the keypad. So bumping it to 4,000 doesn't get it. Bumping it to 5,000 doesn't get in it. Bumping it to 6,000. Right, this is just ridiculous at this point. So maybe 8,000. You're getting into the 60s at least. So now we're out of catastrophic bug pressure zone at maybe 7,000. Yeah. So you're going to need to get to at least 7,000 to kind of have a chance against pests. 8,000 doesn't quite get it, but if we're trying to really balance this, we're getting fairly close at around 9,000. So that's when I would maybe start tinkering a little bit. Now we're at 68, but we're still really high on magnesium and potassium. So now you kind of have the decision, do you want to try and further dilute your potassium? So I probably would. I would probably do that until my magnesium drops below 10. Yeah, so something like 9,600 parts per million. So that's going to be a handful. So we got 33.99 trying to go all the way to 96. So that's a 182% increase in what's there, and we're going to need to numerically increase 6,200 parts per million of calcium, which is just a ridiculous amount. And frankly, there's a lot of problems in it. There's the financial aspect, there's the execution aspect, there's the volume of minerals aspect. So if you're going to, I guess we could do that. So let's see. So if we go to our amendment math tab, so our bulk density on this soil is a 0.41. And our desired ppm increase is 6201. So 6,200 parts per million. If we're going to do oyster shell, let's just keep it simple. That's going to take a little over 10 pounds per 100 square feet, which is, frankly, that's a crap load of minerals. So that's going to be a pretty good financial outpouring to try and correct that. So in this situation, you've got a couple factors. You've got the dysfunctional chemistry. You've also got the chloride, which kind of trumps every other problem. So you can start to try and amend this. Obviously, we'll always put biology into it, but there's only so much the biology can do when mineral chemistry is this dysfunctional. In the situation of this garden, we're always trying to learn things, and we had a very open-minded farmer that's willing to tinker and try different variations and make this a learning lesson. So part of the garden we scraped off the compost, which would ultimately be my advice. It's going to be very difficult to overcome that much chloride, that much bicarbonate. You're going to have a really hard time getting calcium into the plant. Anytime you're not getting calcium into those early vegetative cells, they're going to be vulnerable through the entire life cycle of the plant. So in the context of cannabis, those leaves that we are building in moms and prop and vegetative states that we move into our flowering state, if they were vulnerable from a nutrient density standpoint, they're going to continue to be vulnerable because those cells, instead of being filled with calcium and being very rigid and structured and solid, they're going to be filled with electrolyte and chloride, and that is going to make them weak and watery and mathematically vulnerable to pests. And so as that plant goes into its reproductive, flowering, fruit setting, nut forming, whatever life cycle, even if you correct that soil through that time, those original plant cells were still built in a very vulnerable fashion. And in the case of cannabis, when you move into flowering, you can't spray stuff. So you have plant material in that flowering space that is vulnerable, and there's a point in time when you're no longer allowed to, or no longer allowed, where most people wouldn't spray the flower with any material to try and combat a pest and disease situation. So in the case of this farm, like I said, we scraped off the top layer of compost in the most problematic seed starts and vegetables that were just flat out failure to thrive. We put down the amendments that were appropriate for that native soil to bring it into a balanced state, and we've planted some new seeds. And kind of what we're doing now is we're racing to see, will new seeds that are 30 days younger than its stuck in time counterpart, will they eventually surpass and out yield their plants that are currently in enough chloride to sterilize a YMCA pool? My hunch is that absolutely they're going to blow right past it, and we see this a lot in our cannabis work. In the case of cannabis, it's very common to see very dysfunctional soil chemistry, and a lot of people are very resistant to throwing out a soil when you need to throw it out, or breaking it down, diluting it, amending it. We do that a lot. On our last week's episode with Travis, that's what we did for him. It was a tremendous labor output, and most farmers are not going to be up for that. Travis jumped in, and you're not going to convince him that that was a bad idea. He immediately turned his farm around. And so sometimes you need to take these more aggressive steps. Sometimes in the case of large agricultural scapes, you can't just throw away the soil. So the context is very dependent on what tools are even available to you to make these changes. So if you have any questions, drop them in the chat or below in the comment section. I'll circle back and answer anything that you have. And if you are interested in the soil balancing class, we do have a couple spots left. You can go to our website, crescentsoil.org, click on the Learn tab, and navigate to the Masterclasses. Again, it starts June 2nd. We'll be having class periods at 6 p.m. Mountain Time, and we will go over the math involved for soil chemistry. We will cover the targets, the safe ranges. We go over a lot of practical examples on what to do in all the various situations. And my intention with this class is to fully equip students to perform these mathematical functions, to be self-reliant, to be able to perform this soil chemistry math for themselves. And so for that, I provide the data, I provide the instruction, I provide the calculator tools, and then we also have a forum where we can discuss. So there's students from the first class session that have farm logs, and there's a bunch of discussion going on. And there's also a study group that happens about once a week with students in the class where they get together and work on various practice problems. So to my knowledge, there's not a soil balancing class, course, school, or anything that you can take that actually equips you to perform this math yourself. And that's what we set out to do with this class, because obviously I'm a consultant advisor and I have professional services that I provide, but there's far too many people that want to know how to do this than I can just do mineral balancing all day long. Obviously, I enjoy doing it, but we're moving into a different realm of our advising and our consulting, and part of that is further equipping and empowering farmers to be more self-sufficient and self-reliant. And so my intention with this class is to get you completely up to speed so that you can take a soil data report, work through the numbers, know where you need to go with it, provide you with the strategies for correcting it, and provide you for a calculator for doing the math functions to execute this. Like I said, we have a couple spots left. If you're interested in the class, jump on over to the website. I'll drop the link in the chat. If you have a question on this video, drop it in the comment section. I'll circle back around and we'll catch you next Wednesday for a live Science Bros session. Thanks for tuning in.